Welcome. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to help you drift into deep, peaceful sleep. Before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more bedtime stories. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. There's something profoundly unsettling about the moment you realize someone is watching you, and you have absolutely no idea why. It's not the fear of immediate danger that gets to you first. It's the questions that start eating away at your peace of mind. What do they want? How long have they been there? These questions become a poison that seeps into every quiet moment, every glance out the window, every sound you can't immediately identify. Ethan Morales thought he had figured out the perfect life formula. Work from home, pay your bills, mind your own business. Simple, clean, predictable. For years, this approach had served him well. No drama, no complications, no unwanted surprises. He had chosen solitude the way other people choose security systems or insurance policies, as protection against the unpredictable chaos of human interaction. But what Ethan was about to discover is that sometimes the very thing you think is protecting you becomes the thing that makes you most vulnerable. When he bought that modest two-bedroom house in Wilmot, Pennsylvania, Ethan felt like he was finally creating the sanctuary he'd always wanted. The quiet street, the predictable neighbors, the upstairs office with its perfect view of the front yard. Everything was exactly as it should be. He could open his window for fresh air, take breaks from his screen by watching the peaceful suburban rhythm below. The house felt like an extension of his personality, ordered and private and safe. But safety, as Ethan was about to learn, is often just an illusion we create when we don't yet know what we should be afraid of. The first time he saw the man standing at the end of his driveway, Ethan's mind did what minds do when confronted with something that doesn't fit the pattern. It rationalized. It explained. It found reasonable interpretations for unreasonable behavior. A lost neighbor, perhaps. Someone waiting for a ride. A delivery person checking addresses. The human brain is remarkably skilled at protecting us from truths we're not ready to face, and Ethan's brain was working overtime that October morning to maintain his sense of security. But there was something about the stillness of the figure that cut through all the rational explanations. This wasn't someone who was lost or confused or temporarily paused. This was someone who had chosen to be exactly where he was, doing exactly what he was doing. The man in the gray hoodie wasn't looking around for landmarks or checking his phone or showing any of the typical behaviors of someone with a legitimate reason to be standing at the end of a stranger's driveway. He was simply standing there, staring up at Ethan's house with a focus that felt almost predatory. When Ethan whispered to himself, "Can he see me?" he was asking the wrong question. The right question, the one that would have served him better, was, why does he want to see me? Because in that moment of perfect stillness, of deliberate observation, it became clear that this wasn't a coincidence or a mistake. This was intentional. This was the beginning of something that would fundamentally change how Ethan experienced his own home, his own sense of safety, his own understanding of what it means to be alone. The conversation with his sister Maria that night revealed another layer of the psychological trap Ethan was walking into. She recognized the threat immediately, her instincts sharp and uncompromising. "That's creepy as hell," she said, and she was right. But Ethan found himself caught between two competing needs: the need to take the threat seriously and the need to maintain his belief that his carefully constructed life was still under his control. He wanted to believe it was nothing because the alternative meant accepting that he was no longer the author of his own story, that someone else had decided to make him the focus of their attention without his permission or understanding. This is where stalking reveals its most insidious power. It's not just about the immediate fear or the specific incidents. It's about the way it transforms your relationship with your own life. Every ordinary moment becomes potentially significant. Every routine activity becomes a performance for an unknown audience. Your home stops being a private sanctuary and becomes a stage where someone else holds the spotlight. The very foundations of your sense of safety and autonomy begin to erode, not through violence or explicit threats, but through the simple, devastating knowledge that you are being watched. When Ethan saw the man again the next day, standing in exactly the same spot with that same deliberate focus, the rational explanations began to crumble. This wasn't someone who was lost or confused. This wasn't a coincidence or a mistake. This was someone who had made a decision about Ethan, someone who had assigned him a role in a story that Ethan didn't understand and hadn't consented to participate in. The precision of it, the exact repetition of location and behavior, carried a message that was impossible to misinterpret. I know where you are. I know when you're there. I'm choosing to let you know that I know. The moment during his video call when Ethan went pale, when his coworker noticed his distraction, marked a crucial shift. The stalking was no longer something that happened only when he was alone with his thoughts. It was now powerful enough to intrude into his professional life, to pull his attention away from his responsibilities, to make its presence felt even when he was engaged with other people. This is how psychological warfare works. It doesn't just attack you during vulnerable moments. It creates vulnerable moments in the middle of what should be normal, safe, routine interactions. That evening, when Ethan walked outside to check the view from his stalker's vantage point, he made a discovery that changed everything. From the end of the driveway, his office window was perfectly visible. Not just visible, but prominently displayed like a television screen. Anyone standing in that spot could see him working, could observe his routines, could study his habits and movements. What had felt like a private sanctuary was actually a fishbowl, and someone had been taking advantage of that transparency in ways Ethan had never imagined. This realization transforms the entire narrative from random harassment to calculated surveillance. The man wasn't just standing there to intimidate or confuse. He was standing there to watch, to learn, to gather information. He had found the perfect position to study Ethan's life without Ethan's knowledge or consent, and he had been methodical enough to return to that exact spot multiple times. This suggested planning, patience, and a level of organization that made the threat feel exponentially more serious. The sound of footsteps on gravel at 9 o'clock at night represents the escalation that every stalking victim fears. The behavior was no longer confined to daylight hours or public observation. It had moved closer to his home, later into his private time, more directly into his personal space. Those faint crunching sounds weren't just footsteps. They were an announcement that the boundaries Ethan thought protected him, the assumptions he had made about his safety and privacy, were more fragile than he had ever imagined. What makes this progression so psychologically devastating is how it mirrors the way fear works in our minds. It starts small, with something you can almost dismiss. Then it returns, slightly different, slightly more intrusive, until you can no longer pretend it's nothing. Each incident builds on the last, creating a pattern that becomes impossible to ignore and increasingly difficult to escape. The stalker understands this progression intuitively, knows exactly how to apply psychological pressure in ways that maximize impact while minimizing risk. This is the moment when Ethan's story stops being about a strange man standing in his driveway and becomes about something much more fundamental. The discovery that the safety and privacy we think we have in our own homes, in our own lives, can be stripped away by someone who decides to make us their focus. It's about learning that being alone doesn't always mean being unobserved, and that the very things we do to create security and peace in our lives can become the tools someone else uses to disturb that peace. The real horror of stalking isn't found in dramatic confrontations or violent encounters. It's found in the slow, methodical erosion of your sense that you control your own life, your own space, your own story. It's the realization that someone else has made you the center of their attention in ways you never asked for and cannot easily escape from. And once that realization takes hold, everything changes. Every sound becomes potentially significant. Every routine becomes potentially vulnerable. Every moment of peace becomes temporary, conditional, subject to interruption by someone whose motives you cannot understand and whose next move you cannot predict. Sarah Chin had always been careful about her online presence. As a 28-year-old graphic designer living in Portland, she understood the importance of digital privacy better than most. She used strong passwords, kept her social media accounts private, and never shared personal information with strangers online. But what Sarah didn't realize was that being careful wasn't always enough, especially when someone decides to make you their obsession. It started with a simple freelance project. A client reached out through her professional website, requesting logo design work for what he claimed was a new tech startup. The initial conversation seemed normal enough. Professional inquiries, reasonable timeline discussions, standard budget negotiations. His name was Marcus, and he communicated exclusively through email, which wasn't unusual for remote clients. Sarah had worked with dozens of clients this way without any problems. But something about Marcus felt different from the beginning, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what. His emails were slightly too familiar, peppered with personal comments that seemed inappropriate for a business relationship. He would mention details about her work that suggested he'd spent considerable time studying her portfolio, far more than necessary for a simple logo project. When she sent him initial concepts, his feedback was oddly specific about her design process rather than the actual logos. The first red flag came when Marcus began requesting video calls for what should have been simple email exchanges. When Sarah politely declined, explaining that she preferred to handle design revisions through written communication, he became insistent. He claimed he worked better through face-to-face interaction, that he needed to see her expressions to understand her creative process. The way he phrased it made Sarah uncomfortable, but she attributed her unease to the awkwardness of remote client relationships. Then Marcus started asking questions that had nothing to do with the project. Where did she get her inspiration? Did she work from home or a studio? What were her favorite coffee shops in Portland? At first, Sarah answered these questions thinking they were attempts at friendly small talk, the kind of rapport building that sometimes helped client relationships. But as the questions became more personal and frequent, she realized they felt more like an interrogation than conversation. The project should have taken 2 weeks. After 6 weeks, Marcus had rejected 4 complete logo concepts and requested countless revisions, each time finding new reasons to extend their communication. Sarah began to suspect that the logo wasn't really the point. The rejections felt arbitrary, designed more to maintain contact than to achieve any specific design goal. When she finally told Marcus that she needed to move on to other projects, his response chilled her. "I don't think you understand how much this project means to me," he wrote. "I've been following your work for a long time, Sarah. Much longer than you realize. This collaboration is just the beginning of what we could create together." The email went on to describe specific pieces from her portfolio, including work she'd done for previous clients that wasn't published anywhere online. He knew about projects she'd completed months before he supposedly contacted her. Sarah immediately tried to end the business relationship, offering to refund his deposit and terminate the contract. But Marcus refused to accept this decision. His emails became more frequent, more demanding, and increasingly personal. He began referencing details about her daily routine that he couldn't possibly know through their professional correspondence. He mentioned the coffee shop where she often worked, the time she usually arrived there, even the specific table she preferred by the window. When Sarah realized that Marcus had been observing her physical movements while maintaining their digital relationship, her discomfort transformed into genuine fear. She changed her work locations, varied her schedule, and stopped responding to his emails entirely. But Marcus had apparently anticipated this reaction. The emails continued, now coming from different addresses, each one demonstrating more intimate knowledge of her life. He knew when she ordered takeout and from which restaurants. He referenced TV shows she'd mentioned liking in conversations with friends, conversations that had taken place in public spaces where he could have been listening. Most disturbing of all, he began describing her apartment in detail, mentioning the layout, her furniture, even the art she had hanging on her walls. Sarah realized with horror that he must have found a way to see inside her home. The digital stalking escalated when Marcus began creating fake social media profiles to contact her friends and family. He presented himself as a concerned colleague, claiming that Sarah was going through a difficult time and needed support. These messages were crafted to seem helpful and caring, but they were actually phishing expeditions designed to gather more information about Sarah's personal life, her relationships, and her emotional state. Sarah's sister called her one evening, worried about a message she'd received from someone claiming to be Sarah's business partner. The message had included specific details about family events and personal conversations that no legitimate colleague would have known. This was when Sarah realized that Marcus hadn't just been watching her physically and digitally, He'd been systematically mapping her entire social network, learning about everyone who mattered to her. The psychological impact was devastating. Sarah found herself constantly second-guessing her online activities, wondering what information she might be unconsciously revealing. She began avoiding social media entirely, stopped posting work updates, and became reluctant to meet clients in person. The career she'd built through online networking and digital presence began to suffer as she retreated from the very platforms that had made her business successful. But Marcus seemed to interpret her withdrawal as a challenge rather than a rejection. His messages became more desperate and more threatening. He claimed that he'd invested too much time and energy in their relationship to simply walk away. He described elaborate plans for their future together, plans that involved her relocating to be closer to him, changing her career focus to projects they could collaborate on, even details about the home they would supposedly share. When Sarah finally contacted the police, she discovered how difficult it is to prosecute digital stalking. Marcus had been careful to avoid explicit threats, and many of his communications could be interpreted as overly enthusiastic client correspondence rather than harassment. The fake social media profiles were sophisticated enough to seem legitimate at first glance, and he'd been clever about gathering information in ways that weren't obviously illegal. The detective assigned to her case explained that digital stalking often exists in a legal gray area, especially when the perpetrator is skilled at maintaining plausible deniability. Unless Marcus made specific threats of physical harm or committed clear crimes like hacking into her accounts, the police's options were limited. This reality was almost as frightening as the stalking itself, the knowledge that someone could systematically invade every aspect of your life while remaining technically within legal boundaries. Sarah learned that Marcus had never intended to hire her for legitimate design work. The entire project had been a pretext to establish contact and begin gathering information. Through careful investigation, she discovered that he'd been following her work online for nearly a year before making initial contact. He'd studied her client testimonials, analyzed her social media interactions, and built a comprehensive profile of her personality and interests before crafting his approach. The most unsettling discovery was that Sarah wasn't Marcus's first victim. Through online forums for stalking survivors, she connected with two other women who'd had nearly identical experiences. Marcus had approached them through professional channels, used extended projects as pretexts for ongoing communication, and gradually escalated his surveillance and harassment. The pattern was so precise that it suggested he'd refined his methods through experience. This revelation transformed Sarah's understanding of her situation. She wasn't dealing with someone who'd developed an unhealthy fixation on her specifically. She was dealing with a predator who'd systematically targeted multiple women, someone who'd turned digital stalking into a practiced methodology. The professionalization of her harassment made it feel even more violating and frightening. The resolution came only when Sarah and the other victims coordinated their complaints and provided law enforcement with evidence of Marcus's pattern of behavior across multiple jurisdictions. Even then, the legal process was lengthy and complex, requiring cybersecurity experts to trace his digital footprint and establish clear connections between his various online personas and activities. Sarah eventually had to rebuild her entire online presence, create new professional profiles, and develop elaborate security protocols to protect herself from future digital stalking. She learned to compartmentalize her online activities, use sophisticated privacy tools, and maintain constant vigilance about what information she shared and how it might be used against her. The experience fundamentally changed how Sarah understood the relationship between professional networking and personal safety. She realized that the same digital tools that enabled her career also made her vulnerable to sophisticated forms of harassment and surveillance. The convenience and connectivity of modern online life came with risks that most people never consider until they become targets. Years later, Sarah still checks her online presence regularly for signs of unwanted surveillance. She's become an advocate for stronger digital privacy laws and better training for law enforcement in cyberstalking cases. But the hypervigilance never completely fades, and she remains aware that someone with sufficient motivation and technical skill can find ways to intrude into even the most carefully protected digital life. Jennifer Martinez thought she understood office politics. After 5 years working as a marketing coordinator for a mid-sized tech company in Austin, she'd navigated workplace crushes, awkward advances from colleagues, and the occasional overly persistent coworker. But what started as uncomfortable attention from David, a software engineer from another department, gradually evolved into something far more serious and far more frightening than anything Jennifer had experienced in her professional life. David first appeared at Jennifer's desk on a Tuesday morning in March, ostensibly looking for information about an upcoming product launch. The marketing and engineering departments rarely interacted directly, so his visit seemed unusual but not alarming. He was polite, professional, and asked reasonable questions about timeline and messaging. Jennifer provided the information he requested and thought nothing more about the encounter. But David returned the next day with follow-up questions that seemed unnecessary for his role. Then again the following day with different questions that could have been answered through email or by consulting publicly available documentation. By the end of the week, David's visits had become daily occurrences, and Jennifer began to suspect that gathering information wasn't his primary motivation. The conversations started extending beyond work topics. David would linger at Jennifer's desk, asking about her weekend plans, her interests outside of work, her opinions on various subjects that had nothing to do with their respective projects. He seemed particularly interested in her schedule, asking when she typically arrived at the office, when she took lunch breaks, and what time she usually left for the day. Jennifer tried to maintain professional boundaries, keeping their interactions brief and focused on work-related topics. But David seemed oblivious to her subtle cues that she wasn't interested in personal conversation. He began bringing her coffee in the mornings, leaving small gifts on her desk, and finding excuses to walk past her workspace multiple times throughout the day. Other colleagues started noticing David's frequent presence in their department. Jennifer's desk mate, Lisa, commented on how often the software engineer seemed to have questions that required in-person consultation. Doesn't he know how to use email? Lisa joked one afternoon after David's third visit of the day. But Jennifer wasn't laughing. She was beginning to feel uncomfortable with the level of attention and the way David seemed to be studying her rather than simply seeking information. The situation escalated when David began timing his breaks to coincide with Jennifer's. If she went to the kitchen for coffee, he would appear moments later. If she stepped outside for fresh air, he would emerge from the building shortly after. At first, Jennifer assumed these encounters were coincidental. The office building wasn't that large, and employees often had similar schedules. But the timing was too consistent to be accidental. David's knowledge of Jennifer's routine became increasingly detailed and unsettling. He would reference meetings she had attended that weren't on any public calendar. He knew about phone calls she'd taken with specific clients, conversations that had happened in her private office with the door closed. He seemed aware of her workload and deadlines in ways that suggested he was monitoring her activities far more closely than any legitimate work collaboration would require. The breakthrough moment came when Jennifer realized that David had somehow gained access to her work computer or email account. During a conversation about a project deadline, he referenced an email exchange she'd had with her supervisor, an exchange that had occurred after hours and involved sensitive information about personnel decisions. There was no legitimate way David could have known about that communication. Jennifer immediately contacted the IT department to investigate potential security breaches. The IT team discovered that someone had been accessing her email account using credentials that appeared to be legitimate, suggesting either sophisticated hacking or inside knowledge of system vulnerabilities. The access logs showed that someone had been reading her correspondence for weeks, including personal emails she'd sent and received during lunch breaks. This discovery transformed Jennifer's understanding of her situation from uncomfortable workplace attention to serious invasion of privacy. David hadn't just been observing her public behavior, he'd been systematically violating her digital privacy, reading her communications, and using that information to manipulate their interactions. The gifts he'd brought her were based on preferences he'd learned by reading her personal emails. The topics he'd chosen for conversation were informed by private communications with friends and family. Jennifer reported the situation to Human Resources, but the response was disappointingly bureaucratic. The HR representative seemed more concerned about potential legal liability than about Jennifer's safety and privacy. They promised to investigate, but their initial approach was to schedule separate meetings with Jennifer and David to hear both sides of the story, as if there were two equally valid perspectives on unauthorized email access and workplace surveillance. Meanwhile, David seemed to sense that Jennifer was taking action against him. His behavior became more aggressive and more desperate. He began sending her long emails explaining his feelings, describing their relationship as deeper and more meaningful than she supposedly realized. He claimed that he'd been trying to understand her better so he could be a better friend and colleague, and he accused her of misinterpreting his genuine concern and interest. The emails revealed the extent of David's surveillance and the disturbing nature of his thought processes. He described in detail her daily routines, her interactions with other colleagues, even her emotional state during various meetings and phone calls. He'd been watching her so closely that he knew when she was stressed, when she was happy, when she was frustrated with specific projects or people. This level of observation went far beyond casual workplace awareness. It was systematic psychological profiling. When Jennifer's supervisor finally became involved, they discovered that David had also been accessing other employees' accounts and monitoring communications across multiple departments. He'd apparently been using his technical skills and access privileges to conduct widespread surveillance of his colleagues, with Jennifer as his primary focus but not his only target. This revelation finally prompted the company to take serious action. The investigation revealed that David had been exploiting security vulnerabilities to access not just email accounts but also calendar systems, project management tools, and even security camera footage. He'd been tracking employees' movements throughout the office building, monitoring who they met with, what meetings they attended, and how long they spent in various locations. The scope of his surveillance operation was staggering and had been going on for months before anyone noticed. Jennifer learned that several other female colleagues had experienced similar attention from David, but they'd attributed his behavior to social awkwardness rather than predatory surveillance. He'd been particularly skilled at targeting women who were relatively new to the company or who worked in departments with less direct oversight. His technical expertise had allowed him to gather information and monitor activities in ways that made his knowledge seem like coincidence or good observation skills rather than systematic stalking. The psychological impact on Jennifer was profound and long-lasting. She began to distrust her own judgment about normal workplace interactions, wondering if other colleagues might be monitoring her activities or if she was being paranoid. The knowledge that someone had been reading her private communications made her feel exposed and vulnerable in ways that extended far beyond the workplace. Even after David was terminated and banned from company property, Jennifer struggled with anxiety about digital privacy and workplace security. She found herself constantly checking her computer for signs of unauthorized access, avoiding sensitive communications at work, and feeling suspicious of colleagues who showed friendly interest in her activities or schedule. The company eventually had to invest in comprehensive security upgrades and provide counseling services for affected employees. They also faced legal challenges from employees who sued over privacy violations and inadequate protection from workplace stalking. Jennifer participated in these legal proceedings, but the process was lengthy and emotionally draining, requiring her to relive and document the extent of the surveillance she'd endured. The experience taught Jennifer that workplace stalking can be particularly insidious because it occurs in an environment where people are expected to be professional and collaborative. The normal boundaries of personal privacy are already somewhat fluid in office settings, making it easier for predators to exploit access and information sharing systems for inappropriate purposes. She also learned that technical expertise can be weaponized for stalking in ways that are difficult to detect and even more difficult to prosecute. David's skills had allowed him to conduct surveillance that would have been impossible without specialized knowledge of computer systems and network security. This made his stalking more sophisticated and more invasive than traditional forms of workplace harassment. Years later, Jennifer remains an advocate for stronger workplace privacy protections and better training for managers and HR personnel in recognizing and responding to stalking behaviors. She's learned to be more assertive about setting boundaries with colleagues and more vigilant about protecting her digital privacy, But she's also learned that individual vigilance isn't enough when organizations don't take stalking seriously or lack adequate security measures to protect employees from predatory behavior. Maya Patel had built her entire career around social media presence. As a 26-year-old lifestyle blogger and Instagram influencer with 150,000 followers, she understood that sharing her life online was both her profession and her vulnerability. She'd dealt with trolls, spam accounts, and the occasional overly enthusiastic fan, but nothing had prepared her for Alex, a follower who began as just another username in her comments section and gradually became the most terrifying presence in her life. Alex first appeared as a supportive commenter on Maya's posts about sustainable fashion. His comments were thoughtful, engaging, and demonstrated genuine interest in the environmental and ethical issues Maya advocated for. Unlike many followers who left generic praise or emoji responses, Alex wrote substantive comments that showed he was actually reading her captions and thinking about the content she shared. For several months, Alex was exactly the kind of follower every influencer hopes to cultivate: engaged, supportive, and intellectually curious. He shared her posts to his own account, tagged friends who might be interested in sustainable fashion, and contributed to meaningful discussions in her comments section. Maya even began to recognize his username and look forward to his thoughtful responses to her content. The shift began subtly, in ways that Maya initially interpreted as flattering rather than concerning. Alex's comments became more personal, referencing not just the content of her posts but details about her life that required careful attention to everything she shared. He would mention her favorite coffee shop based on a background detail in one photo, reference a book she'd shown on her nightstand weeks earlier, or comment on her mood based on subtle changes in her facial expressions across different posts. Maya was impressed by Alex's attention to detail and his apparent genuine interest in her life and work. Many influencers struggle with feeling like their followers don't really see them as complete people, so Alex's comprehensive engagement felt refreshing and validating. She began to interact with his comments more directly, responding to his questions and even asking for his opinions on various topics she was considering covering. But Alex's engagement began to extend beyond Maya's public posts. He started sending direct messages, initially asking thoughtful questions about her content strategy and offering suggestions for future posts. The messages were respectful and helpful, and Maya appreciated having a follower who seemed to understand the business side of influencing as well as the creative aspects. The messages gradually became more frequent and more personal. Alex began sharing details about his own life, describing how Maya's content had inspired changes in his lifestyle and purchasing habits. He wrote long messages about his struggles with various personal issues, positioning Maya as someone who'd helped him through difficult times. While Maya was touched by these stories, they also made her feel an uncomfortable sense of responsibility for Alex's emotional well-being. Alex's messages revealed an unsettling level of knowledge about Maya's daily routine and personal habits. He would reference things she'd mentioned in Instagram stories that had expired, suggesting he was screenshotting or saving everything she shared. He knew about events she'd attended based on location tags, people she'd spent time with based on tagged photos, even approximate times when she posted content based on patterns he'd apparently tracked over months. The first clear red flag came when Alex began commenting on posts before Maya had finished uploading them. Instagram's algorithm sometimes shows posts to close friends or highly engaged followers before they're fully public, but Alex's immediate responses suggested he was monitoring her account obsessively, refreshing her profile constantly to catch new content the moment it appeared. Maya started noticing that Alex seemed to have created multiple accounts to interact with her content. She began seeing comments and messages from usernames that used similar language patterns and referenced information that only Alex had previously mentioned. When she blocked one account for becoming too invasive, new accounts would appear within hours, continuing the same conversation threads and demonstrating the same detailed knowledge of her life. The situation escalated when Alex began showing up at locations Maya had posted about on Instagram. She would share a story from a new restaurant or coffee shop, and within days she would spot someone who looked like Alex's profile picture lingering in those same locations. At first, Maya assumed these sightings were coincidental. Los Angeles was a large city, But the influencer scene operated within relatively small geographic areas where running into other content creators wasn't unusual. But the encounters became too frequent and too precisely timed to be accidental. Alex would appear at events Maya attended, always maintaining distance but making sure she could see him. He would position himself in her line of sight at coffee shops she frequented, in stores she shopped at, even at the gym she'd mentioned joining in her stories. He never approached her directly, never tried to speak to her in person, but his presence felt deliberate and threatening. Maya realized that Alex had been using her social media content to map her entire life, her favorite locations, her daily schedule, her social circle, even her travel plans when she posted about upcoming trips. He'd turned her Instagram account into a surveillance tool, using the information she shared to track and monitor her physical movements in real time. When Maya tried to address the situation by posting about online safety and the importance of maintaining boundaries between influencers and followers, Alex's response was swift and alarming. He sent her dozens of direct messages expressing hurt and betrayal, claiming that she was targeting him unfairly and that their relationship was special and different from her interactions with other followers. The messages revealed the depth of Alex's delusion about their relationship. He described their interaction as a meaningful friendship, referred to inside jokes and shared moments that existed only in his imagination, and expressed genuine confusion about why Maya would want to limit their connection. He'd apparently created an elaborate fantasy relationship based on her public social media presence, interpreting her general content as personal communication directed specifically at him. Alex began using his knowledge of Maya's social circle to escalate his harassment. He started contacting other influencers she collaborated with, her friends who appeared in her posts, even brands she worked with professionally. He presented himself as someone close to Maya who had concerns about her well-being or her business practices, using insider information gathered from her social media to make these contacts seem legitimate. The professional impact was devastating. Several brands pulled partnership deals after receiving concerning messages from Alex that made them question Maya's stability and professionalism. Friends began distancing themselves after Alex contacted them with detailed questions about Maya's personal life and emotional state. Her entire social and professional network began to feel contaminated by Alex's intrusion. Maya discovered that Alex had also been creating fake accounts to harass her followers who showed too much interest in her content. He'd apparently decided that he had special status in her online community and that other followers were competition for her attention. He would send threatening messages to people who left flirty comments on her posts or who seemed to be developing ongoing conversation threads with Maya. When Maya finally went to the police, she learned how difficult it is to prosecute social media stalking. Alex had been careful to avoid explicit threats, and much of his behavior could be interpreted as overly enthusiastic fan engagement rather than harassment. The fake accounts were sophisticated, the physical appearances could be coincidental, and his contacts with her professional network could be seen as misguided concern rather than deliberate sabotage. The detective assigned to her case explained that social media stalking exists in a legal gray area where the line between public engagement and harassment is often unclear. Maya's content was publicly available, so accessing and referencing it wasn't illegal. Alex's physical presence at public locations wasn't trespassing unless he violated specific restraining order terms. Even his contacts with her network could be protected speech unless they contained clear threats or false information. Maya realized that building her career on social media presence had made her uniquely vulnerable to this type of sophisticated stalking. The very thing that enabled her professional success, sharing her life online, had provided Alex with all the information he needed to conduct comprehensive surveillance and harassment. The platforms that generated her income had become tools for someone to systematically violate her privacy and safety. The resolution required Maya to essentially rebuild her entire online presence. She had to create new accounts, implement strict privacy measures, and develop elaborate protocols for sharing content without revealing identifying information. She learned to use decoy locations, delay posting content, and carefully review every image for background details that could be used for tracking. But the psychological impact was profound and lasting. Maya struggled with the knowledge that someone had been studying every aspect of her shared life, analyzing her emotions and relationships, and using that information to manipulate and control her real-world experiences. The spontaneity and authenticity that had made her content engaging became impossible to maintain when every post had to be carefully evaluated for potential security risks. The experience taught Maya that social media influence comes with unique and poorly understood safety risks. The platforms that enable content creators to build audiences and generate income also make them vulnerable to sophisticated forms of digital stalking that can easily translate into real-world harassment and professional sabotage. Years later, Maya continues to advocate for better stalking protections on social media platforms and stronger legal frameworks for prosecuting social media-based harassment. She's learned to maintain her career while implementing extensive security measures, but the hypervigilance and constant threat assessment have fundamentally changed how she experiences both her online presence and her offline life. Tom Harrison had always valued privacy. When he and his wife Linda bought their dream house in a quiet suburb outside Denver, they specifically chose a property with a large yard, mature trees, and enough distance from neighboring homes to create a real sense of seclusion. They'd lived in apartments and condos for years, dealing with noisy neighbors and thin walls, so the prospect of finally having space and privacy felt like achieving the American dream. The house next door had been empty for nearly 6 months when they moved in, which only added to the sense of peaceful isolation. Tom and Linda spent their first summer there enjoying evening barbecues on their deck, morning coffee in their garden, and the luxury of being able to move through their home without worrying about disturbing or being disturbed by neighbors. It felt like paradise. Everything changed when Rachel moved into the neighboring house that fall. She was a woman in her early 40s who worked from home as a freelance bookkeeper, and she seemed pleasant enough during their initial introduction. She brought over homemade cookies, complimented their landscaping, and expressed enthusiasm about being part of such a friendly neighborhood. Tom and Linda were relieved to have a considerate neighbor after hearing horror stories from friends about problematic adjacent homeowners. The first signs of trouble were so subtle that Tom dismissed them as coincidence or hypersensitivity. He began noticing that Rachel seemed to be outside working in her yard whenever he and Linda were in their backyard. If they sat on their deck for morning coffee, Rachel would emerge to tend her garden. If they decided to grill dinner, she would appear to water her plants or check her mail. The timing was consistently perfect, as if she were monitoring their movements and deliberately coordinating her outdoor activities with theirs. At first, Tom attributed this pattern to normal suburban rhythms. People often did yard work in the evenings after work, and weekend mornings were popular times for outdoor coffee and garden maintenance. But Rachel's presence became so predictable that Tom began to suspect she was watching their house and timing her appearances to ensure maximum visibility of their activities. The suspicion became certainty when Tom tested his theory by varying his routine. He began stepping onto his deck at unusual times, mid-afternoon on weekdays, early evening when most people were having dinner, even late at night when he was having trouble sleeping. Without fail, Rachel would appear in her yard within minutes, always with some plausible reason for being outside but clearly focused more on observing Tom than on whatever task she claimed to be doing. Rachel's observations began to manifest in conversations that revealed disturbing levels of knowledge about Tom and Linda's daily habits. She would comment on the times they came and went, the visitors they received, even the delivery trucks that came to their house. She knew when Linda worked late, when Tom traveled for business, and when they had guests staying with them. This information always emerged in contexts that made it seem like casual neighbor awareness rather than systematic surveillance. The surveillance escalated when Rachel began commenting on activities that occurred inside their house. She would ask about TV shows they'd been watching, meals they'd been cooking, even conversations they'd had in what they believed were private spaces. Rachel always presented this knowledge as coincidental awareness, sounds that carried through windows, activities visible through glass doors, normal neighbor observations. But the specificity and consistency of her information suggested much more deliberate monitoring. Tom realized that Rachel had positioned herself to have sight lines into multiple windows of their house from various locations in her yard. She'd arranged her gardening stations, outdoor furniture, and even her trash collection area to maximize her ability to observe their home's interior spaces. What had initially seemed like normal yard maintenance was actually a carefully designed surveillance network. The psychological impact began to affect every aspect of Tom and Linda's home life. They found themselves closing blinds during the day, avoiding their backyard and deck, and speaking in whispers near windows. The house that had represented freedom and privacy became a place where they felt constantly watched and evaluated. Their sanctuary had become a fishbowl, with Rachel as the persistent observer studying their every move. Rachel's behavior became more intrusive and more bizarre. She began timing her outdoor activities to coincide not just with their visible presence but with their private moments. If Tom and Linda were having an argument, Rachel would appear in her yard, lingering near the property line as if trying to overhear their conversation. If they were enjoying intimate time together, she would suddenly decide to do loud yard work right outside their bedroom window. The most disturbing escalation came when Rachel began interacting with their visitors and service providers. She would approach delivery drivers with questions about packages they were bringing to Tom's house. She would strike up conversations with their friends and family members, subtly gathering information about their relationships, their plans, and their opinions about various topics. She was essentially conducting intelligence-gathering operations on their personal and social life. Tom discovered that Rachel had been telling other neighbors stories about him and Linda that contained accurate information presented in misleading contexts. She would describe their habits and activities in ways that made them sound antisocial, suspicious, or problematic. She knew enough about their actual behavior to make her complaints seem credible, but she was interpreting everything through the lens of someone who had been systematically violating their privacy. When Tom finally confronted Rachel directly about her intrusive behavior, her response was a masterclass in gaslighting and manipulation. She claimed to be confused by his accusations, suggested that he was being paranoid and antisocial, and positioned herself as a concerned neighbor who was only trying to be friendly and community-minded. She made Tom feel like he was overreacting to normal neighborly interest and awareness. But Rachel's facade slipped enough during their confrontation to reveal the true extent of her obsession. She referenced specific conversations Tom had had with Linda about Rachel's behavior, conversations that had taken place inside their house with windows closed. She knew about private discussions they'd had regarding whether to install security cameras, conversations they'd specifically had in rooms with no sight lines from her property. The realization that Rachel had somehow been eavesdropping on their private indoor conversations escalated Tom's concerns from annoyance to genuine fear. He began to suspect that she had installed listening devices or found other ways to monitor their indoor activities. The scope of her surveillance suggested planning and technical capability that went far beyond casual neighbor nosiness. Tom hired a security consultant to sweep their house for listening devices and to assess potential vulnerabilities in their privacy. The consultant found evidence of sophisticated surveillance equipment aimed at their property from multiple locations in Rachel's yard. She had installed cameras disguised as garden decorations, directional microphones hidden in outdoor speakers, and even devices designed to pick up conversations through window vibrations. The legal battle that followed was complex and frustrating. Rachel had been careful to position her surveillance equipment on her own property, making it difficult to prosecute her for trespassing or breaking and entering. The devices she used were commercially available and technically legal to own, even though using them to spy on neighbors violated privacy laws. Proving intent and demonstrating harm required extensive documentation and expert testimony. The neighborhood dynamics became toxic as other residents chose sides in the dispute. Rachel had spent months cultivating relationships with neighbors, presenting herself as friendly and community-minded while subtly undermining Tom and Linda's reputation. When the surveillance equipment was discovered, some neighbors expressed shock and supported Tom, but others had been so influenced by Rachel's stories that they questioned whether the evidence was legitimate. The resolution required restraining orders, legal fees, and ultimately Rachel's decision to sell her house and move away. But the damage to Tom and Linda's sense of security and privacy was profound and lasting. They installed extensive security measures, rebuilt relationships with neighbors who had been influenced by Rachel's manipulation, and struggled with anxiety about future neighbors and potential surveillance. The experience taught Tom that neighbor harassment can be particularly insidious because it occurs in the place where people should feel most safe and secure. The proximity and persistence possible in neighbor stalking creates unique psychological pressures and practical challenges. Unlike stalking by strangers or acquaintances, neighbor harassment is impossible to escape simply by changing routines or avoiding specific locations. Tom and Linda eventually moved to a different neighborhood, but they remained hypervigilant about neighbor relationships and property security. They learned to recognize early warning signs of intrusive behavior and to address boundary violations before they escalated. But they also learned that the dream of suburban privacy and security can be shattered by a single individual who decides to make your life their obsession. Jessica Walsh thought she was being smart about online dating. At 32, she'd been using various dating apps for 3 years and had developed what she considered a sophisticated approach to digital romance. She used recent photos, wrote honest profiles, and always met potential dates in public places. She'd had her share of disappointing dates and awkward conversations, but nothing had prepared her for what happened when she matched with someone calling himself Chris Thompson. Chris seemed perfect on paper. His profile showed him as a 34-year-old architect living in Chicago, the same city where Jessica worked as a marketing manager. His photos showed an attractive man with an easy smile, engaged in activities that suggested creativity and an active lifestyle. His profile text was thoughtful and funny, demonstrating the kind of emotional intelligence that Jessica found appealing in potential partners. Their initial conversation through the dating app was engaging and natural. Chris asked thoughtful questions about Jessica's work and interests, shared entertaining stories about his own life, and demonstrated the kind of wit and curiosity that made Jessica genuinely excited about the prospect of meeting him in person. After a week of messaging, they moved their conversation to text messaging and began planning their first date. The first red flag appeared in Chris's texting patterns. His messages were frequently perfectly timed to coincide with moments when Jessica was likely to be checking her phone, during her lunch break, on her commute home from work, in the evening after she typically finished dinner. At first, Jessica attributed this timing to coincidence or to Chris being similarly busy with work schedules that mirrored her own. But the timing was too consistent to be accidental. Chris's messages would arrive within minutes of Jessica finishing meetings, completing workouts, or returning home from social events. He seemed to have an uncanny ability to know exactly when she would be available and receptive to communication. This suggested either remarkable intuition about her schedule or some form of monitoring that Jessica couldn't immediately identify. Chris's knowledge of Jessica's activities began to extend beyond what she had shared with him directly. He would reference restaurants she'd been to recently, movies she'd seen, even books she'd been reading, information that she hadn't mentioned in their conversations. When Jessica asked how he knew these details, Chris would claim that he'd made lucky guesses based on her personality or that they had so much in common that their tastes naturally aligned. The explanations felt plausible individually, but collectively they painted a picture of someone who was gathering information about Jessica's life through methods he wasn't willing to acknowledge. She began to suspect that Chris was stalking her social media accounts more thoroughly than normal dating app behavior would warrant, possibly even accessing information she hadn't made publicly available. When they finally arranged to meet for coffee at a popular downtown Chicago cafe, Chris's behavior during the date confirmed Jessica's growing suspicions. He referenced specific details about the neighborhood that suggested he'd been there recently, despite claiming it was his first time visiting that particular area. He knew about construction projects affecting nearby streets, mentioned changes to local businesses, and demonstrated familiarity with the area that contradicted his supposed unfamiliarity. More disturbing was Chris's knowledge of Jessica's routines and preferences that went beyond anything she'd shared in their conversations. He ordered her favorite type of coffee before she'd mentioned her preference. He suggested they sit at a specific table that happened to offer the best view of the street, accommodating her habit of people watching that she'd never discussed with him. He even commented on her choice of jewelry in ways that suggested he'd seen her wearing similar pieces before. During their conversation, Chris revealed an unsettling level of knowledge about Jessica's work colleagues, her friends, and her family members. He would casually mention details about people in her life that she was certain she hadn't shared, then deflect her questions about how he knew these things by changing the subject or making jokes about having good memory for details. Jessica left the date feeling confused and unsettled. Chris had been charming and attentive, but his mysterious knowledge of her life created an undercurrent of anxiety that she couldn't shake. She decided to test her suspicions by varying her routines and observing whether Chris's behavior reflected awareness of these changes. The test results were immediate and frightening. When Jessica changed her usual gym schedule, Chris's texting patterns shifted to match her new availability. When she tried working from a different coffee shop, he casually mentioned the new location in conversation. When she visited her sister unexpectedly, he somehow knew she was out of town and adjusted his communication accordingly. Jessica realized that Chris had been conducting systematic surveillance of her activities, either through digital monitoring of her devices and accounts or through physical observation of her movements. The scope of his knowledge suggested sophisticated stalking methods that went far beyond casual social media research or lucky guesses about her preferences. When Jessica confronted Chris about his uncanny knowledge of her life, his response revealed the true extent of his deception and manipulation. He admitted that he'd been following her activities for months before they matched on the dating app. He'd created his profile specifically to appeal to her based on extensive research into her interests, values, and relationship history. Chris explained his behavior as romantic dedication rather than stalking. He claimed that he'd fallen in love with Jessica based on observing her from a distance and that everything he'd done was motivated by genuine affection and desire to make their relationship perfect. He seemed genuinely confused by Jessica's negative reaction to his surveillance, interpreting her distress as a misunderstanding rather than a legitimate response to violation of her privacy. The revelation that their entire relationship had been built on deception and surveillance was psychologically devastating for Jessica. Every moment of connection she'd felt, every conversation they'd shared, every aspect of their compatibility had been manufactured through Chris's manipulation and careful study of her personality and preferences. Nothing about their interaction had been genuine or spontaneous. Jessica discovered that Chris had created multiple fake dating profiles to approach her, testing different personalities and approaches to see which would be most appealing. When she'd swiped left on his previous attempts, he'd refined his strategy and created new identities until he found one that successfully matched with her. This suggested a level of persistence and deception that transformed their relationship from romantic connection to predatory manipulation. The digital stalking extended far beyond dating app interactions. Chris had somehow gained access to Jessica's email accounts, text messages, and social media activities. He'd been reading her private communications with friends and family, monitoring her online purchases and browsing history, and using this information to anticipate her needs and preferences in ways that seemed caring but were actually invasive. When Jessica tried to end contact with Chris, his response escalated from romantic persistence to threatening behavior. He sent hundreds of messages across multiple platforms, created new fake accounts when she blocked his known profiles, and began contacting her friends and family members with stories designed to make them worry about her mental health and decision-making. Chris's manipulation of Jessica's social network was particularly sophisticated and damaging. He presented himself to her loved ones as a concerned boyfriend who was worried about Jessica's behavior. He used intimate knowledge gathered through surveillance to make his concerns seem legitimate, referencing private struggles and personal details that only someone close to Jessica would normally know. The professional impact was severe when Chris began contacting Jessica's workplace with false reports about her reliability and mental stability. He'd learned enough about her job responsibilities and workplace relationships to craft complaints that seemed credible to people who didn't know the full context of his harassment. Jessica found herself having to explain to supervisors and colleagues that she was being stalked, a conversation that felt humiliating and professionally damaging. Jessica learned that Chris had been using sophisticated technology to monitor her activities, including spyware installed on her devices and GPS tracking through various applications. He'd gained access to her location data, communication records, and browsing history through methods that required significant technical knowledge and criminal intent. The legal process was complicated by the interstate nature of Chris's crimes and the difficulty of proving that his surveillance had occurred without her consent. Much of the evidence was digital and required forensic analysis to establish Chris's responsibility. The fake dating profiles, spoofed communications, and manufactured evidence he'd created to support his version of their relationship made it challenging for law enforcement to separate truth from deception. Jessica had to completely rebuild her digital life, changing passwords, replacing devices, and implementing extensive security measures to protect herself from ongoing surveillance. She learned that recovering from digital stalking requires not just ending the harassment but also repairing the damage to personal and professional relationships that occurs when someone systematically manipulates your social network. The psychological recovery was lengthy and complex. Jessica struggled with trusting new romantic connections, wondering whether future partners' knowledge of her preferences and compatibility with her interests was genuine or the result of research and manipulation. The experience had corrupted her ability to distinguish between normal relationship development and predatory surveillance. Years later, Jessica remains an advocate for stronger protections against dating app fraud and digital stalking. She learned that the anonymity and accessibility of online dating platforms make them attractive tools for predators who want to identify and approach victims in ways that seem legitimate and romantic rather than threatening and criminal. The experience taught Jessica that modern stalking often begins long before victims realize they're being targeted. The gathering of information, the creation of fake online personas, and the systematic study of potential victims can occur for months before the first contact, making it nearly impossible for targets to recognize the threat until they're already deeply involved in manipulated relationships. She also learned that digital stalking can be more invasive and more damaging than traditional forms of harassment because it penetrates every aspect of modern life: work, relationships, entertainment, shopping, communication. When someone gains access to your digital life, they gain access to everything, and recovering from that violation requires rebuilding not just your sense of safety but your entire relationship with technology and online interaction. Catherine Rivers thought she had handled her breakup with Michael correctly. After 18 months of dating, she'd realized that their relationship had become unhealthy, marked by Michael's increasing possessiveness and attempts to control her social life and career decisions. When she ended things, Catherine was direct but compassionate, explaining her concerns and making it clear that she needed space to focus on her own growth and happiness. Michael had seemed to accept the breakup initially. He'd been upset, naturally, but he hadn't argued or made threats. He'd asked for a chance to change, promised to work on the controlling behaviors Catherine had identified, and requested that they try couples counseling. When Catherine explained that she'd made her decision and wasn't interested in salvaging the relationship, Michael appeared to respect her choice. For the first month after their breakup, Michael maintained appropriate boundaries. He didn't contact Catherine directly, didn't show up at places they'd frequented together, and seemed to be giving her the space she'd requested. Catherine began to feel relieved that she'd misjudged his potential for problematic post-breakup behavior. She'd heard horror stories from friends about exes who became stalkers or harassers, and she was grateful that Michael seemed mature enough to handle rejection gracefully. The shift began subtly, in ways that Catherine initially interpreted as coincidental rather than deliberate. She would see Michael at the grocery store she shopped at regularly, at the coffee shop near her apartment, or at the gym where she'd been a member for years. These encounters felt awkward but not necessarily threatening. Chicago was a large city, but people who dated for over a year inevitably developed overlapping routines and familiar locations. But the encounters became too frequent and too conveniently timed to be accidental. Michael would appear at the exact coffee shop where Catherine was working on freelance projects, arriving shortly after she'd settled in with her laptop and ordering drinks at nearby tables where he could observe her activities. He would show up at her gym during her regular workout times, positioning himself on equipment that offered clear sight lines to her preferred areas. When Catherine varied her routines to test whether the encounters were coincidental, Michael's appearances shifted to match her new patterns. If she tried a different coffee shop, he would discover and frequent that location. If she changed her workout schedule, he would adjust his gym visits accordingly. The precision of his timing and location choices made it clear that he was monitoring her movements and deliberately positioning himself to maximize encounters. Michael's behavior during these encounters was carefully calibrated to seem innocent while maintaining psychological pressure. He would acknowledge Catherine politely but briefly, never approaching her directly or initiating extended conversation. He would appear absorbed in his own activities, reading, working out, talking on the phone, while maintaining awareness of her presence and activities. The apparent casualness of Michael's behavior made it difficult for Catherine to address directly. When she finally confronted him about the frequent encounters, he expressed surprise and claimed that he was simply maintaining his normal routines. He pointed out that he'd been going to that gym and those coffee shops long before they'd broken up, which was technically true but ignored the obvious change in frequency and timing of his visits. Michael's gaslighting was sophisticated and psychologically devastating. He made Catherine question her own perceptions and judgment, suggesting that she was being paranoid or self-centered in thinking that his presence was connected to her activities. He positioned himself as the victim of her suspicious and unreasonable accusations, claiming that she was trying to control his movements and prevent him from living his normal life. The stalking escalated when Michael began involving Catherine's friends and family in his campaign to re-establish contact. He would reach out to mutual friends with expressions of concern about Catherine's emotional state and well-being. He would share carefully selected details about their relationship that made Catherine seem unstable or unreasonable, positioning himself as a caring ex-boyfriend who was worried about someone he still loved. Michael's manipulation of Catherine's social network was particularly effective because it contained enough truth to seem credible. He would reference real arguments they'd had or genuine struggles Catherine had experienced, but he would present these situations in contexts that made her seem irrational or mentally unstable while portraying himself as patient and supportive. Catherine began losing friends who believed Michael's version of their relationship and breakup. People she'd known for years started questioning her judgment and mental health based on Michael's carefully crafted narrative. Some friends tried to mediate between them, genuinely believing that Catherine was overreacting to Michael's attempts to maintain friendship and that their problems could be resolved through better communication. The professional impact was severe when Michael began contacting Catherine's clients and colleagues with concerns about her reliability and emotional stability. As a freelance graphic designer, Catherine's reputation and client relationships were crucial to her livelihood. Michael's interference threatened both her current projects and her future business prospects. Michael had learned enough about Catherine's work during their relationship to craft believable complaints and concerns. He knew which clients were demanding, which projects had challenging deadlines, and which professional relationships were most important to her success. He used this knowledge to contact key people in her professional network with stories designed to undermine confidence in her capabilities and professionalism. When Catherine finally obtained a restraining order against Michael, his response revealed the depth of his delusion and the extent of his preparation for legal challenges. He had been documenting their encounters and interactions, creating a counter-narrative that portrayed Catherine as the unstable party and himself as the victim of harassment and false accusations. Michael had saved text messages, emails, and social media posts that, taken out of context, could be interpreted as evidence of Catherine's mental instability or vindictive behavior toward him. He had screenshots of her social media activity, records of places she'd visited, and even photographs of her taken without her knowledge during his surveillance activities. The legal process revealed that Michael had been conducting comprehensive surveillance of Catherine's activities for months, using both digital monitoring and physical observation to track her movements, relationships, and professional activities. He had created detailed records of her routines, documented her interactions with other people, and gathered information that he planned to use to either win her back or punish her for rejecting him. Catherine discovered that Michael had installed tracking software on devices they'd shared during their relationship, giving him access to her location data, communication records, and browsing history long after their breakup. He'd been reading her private messages, monitoring her dating app activities, and gathering intelligence about her attempts to move on with her life. The psychological warfare was methodical and devastating. Michael had been using his knowledge of Catherine's insecurities, fears, and emotional triggers to design harassment that would maximize psychological impact while minimizing legal risk. He understood exactly which of her relationships were most important, which professional connections were most valuable, and which personal vulnerabilities would be most painful to exploit. The recovery process required Catherine to rebuild nearly every aspect of her life. She had to repair relationships damaged by Michael's manipulation, restore her professional reputation, and implement extensive security measures to protect herself from ongoing surveillance. She learned that recovering from stalking by an ex-partner is particularly challenging because the perpetrator has intimate knowledge of the victim's life, relationships, and vulnerabilities. Catherine had to move to a new apartment, change her phone number, and alter routines she'd maintained for years. She learned to vary her schedule randomly, use different routes for familiar destinations, and maintain constant vigilance about potential surveillance. The hypervigilance and security measures necessary to protect herself from Michael fundamentally changed how she experienced daily life. The experience taught Catherine that intimate partner stalking is uniquely destructive because it weaponizes the knowledge and trust that develop in close relationships. Ex-partners have access to personal information, social networks, and emotional triggers that make their stalking more targeted and more psychologically damaging than harassment by strangers. She also learned that the legal system is poorly equipped to handle sophisticated psychological harassment that doesn't involve explicit threats or physical violence. Michael's behavior was carefully designed to stay within legal boundaries while maximizing emotional and professional damage, making it difficult to prosecute and nearly impossible to prevent. Years later, Catherine continues to advocate for stronger legal protections against intimate partner stalking and better training for law enforcement in recognizing sophisticated psychological harassment. She learned that ending an unhealthy relationship is sometimes just the beginning of a much longer struggle to reclaim safety and autonomy from someone who refuses to accept rejection. The experience fundamentally changed Catherine's approach to relationships, making her more cautious about sharing personal information and more alert to early warning signs of controlling behavior. She learned that some people view breakups not as endings but as challenges to overcome, and that protecting yourself from that mindset requires constant vigilance and extensive support systems.